Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's dive into a story that feels like something right out of a Cold War spy movie, the Gouzenko Affair. It all begins back in 1945 with this, well, he seemed like just a regular guy, a Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Gouzenko,
Yeah.
who decided that Canada was going to be the place where he spilled some seriously big secrets.
And what's really interesting is that this is happening just days after the end of World War II.
Oh, wow.
Everyone's supposed to be celebrated, right?
Supposed to be.
But behind the scenes, that alliance, that wartime alliance between the West and the Soviet Union, it was already starting to fall apart.
So yeah, Gouzenko decides to defect, but he doesn't exactly sneak away quietly. This guy brings documents with him. And, as a cipher clerk, his job was basically dealing with top-secret coded messages.
Yeah.
This guy had access to some seriously sensitive stuff.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. These weren't just any old documents. What he brought with him exposed a Soviet spy ring operating right here in Canada.
Sure, in Canada.
Yep. And they were targeting all sorts of things. Sensitive government info, even, get this, atomic research.
Atomic research. I mean, that's going to be a huge shock for the Canadian government. This ally that they trusted suddenly revealed as a threat.
Prime Minister Mackenzie King, he was really hesitant to believe it at first. I mean, it's got to be hard, right? To accept that someone you fought alongside could betray you like that.
Yeah, I can only imagine. But Gouzenko's evidence, it was just too much to ignore. So in 1946, the government launches a royal commission to investigate. And what they find is a bombshell.
It really was.
Multiple individuals, many of whom were connected to the Canadian Communist Party. They're all implicated in this spy ring.
And one of the individuals who gets caught up in all this is Fred Rose, a sitting member of parliament.
What?
And his conviction for espionage, it just drove home the point that the Soviets had infiltrated the Canadian government at the highest levels.
I mean, that's a major breach of trust. So what happened next? Did this completely destroy the relationship between Canada and the Soviet Union?
Well, diplomatic relations basically went into a deep freeze. And you got to remember, Canada at this time, they were big advocates for the United Nations, for international cooperation.
Right.
And now they're having to face this new reality, this ideological conflict with the Soviets.
So this defection, it really throws a wrench into Canada's whole foreign policy approach. How do they reconcile this new threat with their commitment to, the UN and diplomacy?
Well, the historian Robert Bothwell, he called this period a diplomatic reorientation for Canada. It forced Canada to step out from under the shadow of the British Commonwealth and really confront the realities of the emerging Cold War.
It's like Canada suddenly thrust onto the world stage, forced to pick a side.
And domestically, it exposed some serious vulnerabilities in Canada's security.
Right.
The government responds by expanding the role of the RCMP, giving them more power to monitor and prevent what they called subversive activities.
So basically a crackdown on anyone they suspected of being a communist sympathizer?
It was a big shift, yeah. It marked the beginning of an era of much greater surveillance and scrutiny. And it's something that has arguably continued to this day.
Interesting.
This new focus on security. It also pushed Canada closer to its Western allies, especially the US and the UK, which led to the creation of a very important intelligence sharing network.
You're talking about the Five Eyes Alliance, right?
Exactly. Think of it like a neighborhood watch for spies. It's all about sharing intel between Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand.
To keep tabs on the Soviets.
Right. To keep everyone safe from threats like, Soviet espionage. And it's not a coincidence that this alliance got stronger after the Gouzenko Affair.
Okay, so we've got this dramatic defection, exposed spy rings, this huge betrayal of trust. And it's amazing how historians still debate the long-term significance of this event.
Yeah.
It's like the Gouzenko Affair is some kind of Rorschach test for historians.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see it as a necessary wake-up call about security or an overreaction that ended up eroding civil liberties?
It's a great way to put it. There are at least 4 different schools of thought on this, each with its own perspective on the Gouzenko Affair's lasting impact. We've got the Realist school.
The Realists. Those are the folks who really believe in a strong defense and taking a more practical approach to international relations, right? What's their take on Gouzenko?
Well, historians like J.L. Granitstein, he's part of this school, they argue that the Gouzenko Affair was a much-needed reality check for Canada.
Okay.
They think it forced Canada to kind of ditch any naive idealism about the Soviets and adopt a much tougher foreign policy. focused on security and alignment with the U.S.
So the realists, they see this as a Canada grows up moment.
Yeah, exactly.
No more naive idealism. It's time for some serious security.
You got it. And this shift in thinking eventually leads to Canada joining NATO in 1949.
Right.
Which is a pretty big commitment to collective defense.
Weird.
And a clear sign that Canada's picking a side in the Cold War.
Wow. Joining NATO, that was a major step. But not everyone sees it that way, right? You mentioned other schools of thought.
Right. You've also got the liberal internationalists, a cool thought. Historians like John English, they argue that even though security concerns definitely went up after Gouzenko, Canada didn't totally abandon its belief in multilateralism and diplomacy.
Multilateralism.
Yeah.
Meaning working through organizations like the UN to solve problems.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they point to people like Louis Saint Laurent, who became prime minister after Mackenzie King, and his focus on international cooperation, even with this Soviet threat looming.
So a more nuanced take, acknowledging that security is important, but not completely ditching those core values of diplomacy and cooperation. What about the other two schools of thought? You mentioned a new left perspective, which I'm guessing is a little more critical of the whole security crackdown.
Yeah, you're right. The New Left school, represented by historians like Red Whittaker, they're much more concerned about the impact of all of this on civil liberties. They argue that the crackdown on suspected communists in Canada was a total overreaction, fueled by paranoia and, mirroring the Red Scare that was happening in the U.S. at the same time.
So they see this as kind of a witch hunt,
Yeah.
potentially ruining the lives of innocent people
Yeah.
and creating this atmosphere of fear.
That's their main critique, and it's a valid point. Think about the suspicion and fear that must have gripped the country. I mean, your neighbor, your coworker, anyone could be a spy.
Yeah, it's pretty unsettling.
And then finally, we have the post-revisionist school, led by historians like Robert Bothwell, who try to find a middle ground.
The voice of reason. So what's their take on the Gouzenko affair?
Well, they acknowledge that Gouzenko definitely increased security concerns and pushed Canada closer to the West, but they argue that it didn't fundamentally change Canada's commitment to diplomacy and international engagement.
So a bit of both, recognizing the security threat, but also emphasizing the continuity in Canada's foreign policy approach. It's pretty amazing how one event can be interpreted in so many different ways.
It really is. It shows just how complex history is and how our understanding of the past is always evolving. But one thing's for sure, the Gouzenko affair had a huge impact. Not just on Canada, but on the world stage as well.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Let's dive into those global implications in part 2. Okay, so we're back and we're continuing to sort of unpack this incredible Cold War story, the Gouzenko affair. We've seen how this one cipher clerk's defection exposed a Soviet spy ring, shook Canada's trust in its allies, and really sparked this whole debate about, security versus freedom.
And it's a story that just keeps unfolding, right?
Yeah.
We've talked about the impact on Canada, but this thing had ripple effects way beyond Canadian borders.
Yeah, you mentioned those global implications. What exactly were they? It's kind of hard to imagine this one event in Ottawa, sending shockwaves across the world.
Well, you got to think about it. The world's just coming out of World War II. Everyone's trying to figure out what this new world order is going to look like. And then, bam! This Canadian cipher clerk drops a bomb, revealing that the Soviets are engaged in this massive espionage campaign, even targeting their wartime allies.
So Canada was just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
This basically confirmed everyone's worst fears about the Soviets.
Exactly. It really kicked up the anxiety about Soviet espionage around the world. Suddenly, Western governments are looking at each other thinking, who can we trust? Could there be a Soviet spy right here among us?
Yeah, I can only imagine the paranoia.
Oh, absolutely. And it reinforced this idea of the Soviet Union as this expansionist power, unwilling to play by the rules. And that really solidified the ideological division of the Cold War, communism versus democracy, East versus West.
It's amazing to think that this one event happening, thousands of miles away from Moscow or Washington could have such a huge impact on the global stage.
It really is. And remember those documents Gouzenko brought with him? Well, one of the most alarming revelations was that the Soviets were really trying to steal atomic secrets.
Wait, atomic secrets? So this was about more than just, traditional spying. They were trying to get their hands on the most dangerous weapon the world had ever seen.
Exactly. And this is only a few years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
The world had just witnessed the horrific power of nuclear weapons. And now here's proof that the Soviets wanted that power for themselves.
That's terrifying.
It totally threw fuel on the fire of the nuclear arms race. It made the mistrust between the superpowers even worse, and it intensified that Cold War rivalry. It suddenly felt like the world was on the brink of annihilation.
Okay, so let's step back for a minute. We've talked about the global impact, but you also said that this event had a real lasting impact on Canada itself, especially when it comes to its security policies.
Oh, absolutely. The Gouzenko Affair forced Canada to totally rethink how it approached security, both domestically and internationally. Remember that expansion of the RCMP's role we talked about earlier?
Right, right.
Well, that was really just the beginning.
So Canada went from this relatively open and trusting society to a much more security-conscious one.
That's a good way to put it. The government brought in new surveillance measures, they expanded their intelligence gathering capabilities, and tightened up immigration controls. It was all about making sure nothing like the Gouzenko Affair could ever happen again.
I bet the political climate must have been pretty intense.
Oh, it was. There was this real sense of urgency. Like, Canada had to adapt to this new, more dangerous world. And one of the biggest ways they adapted was by getting more involved with the Western alliance system.
Okay, we talked about the Five Eyes alliance before, but how else did this play out? Did Canada become more reliant on the U.S. for its security?
Absolutely. The Gouzenko Affair really hammered home their idea that Canada's security was totally tied to the United States's. So that led to closer military cooperation, joint exercises, and a shared goal of containing Soviet expansionism.
So Canada goes from this relatively independent middle power to a key player in the Western Bloc, all because of this one spy scandal.
It definitely accelerated that transition. And remember, just a few years after Gouzenko defects, Canada joins NATO.
Right.
That was huge. It really solidified Canada's commitment to collective defense and put them firmly in the Western camp.
Joining NATO, that was a game changer. It meant that Canada was now basically pledging to defend its allies against any Soviet aggression.
Exactly. The Gouzenko Affair made it crystal clear that Canada couldn't afford to just sit on the sidelines during the Cold War. They had to pick a side and be ready to defend their interests both at home and abroad.
It's incredible to think how this one event, a cipher clerk walking into a newspaper office with some documents, could have such a huge and lasting impact on Canada's place in the world.
You know, it really is. It just shows how interconnected global events are and how something that seems isolated can trigger these chain reactions with really far-reaching consequences. But there's another layer to all this that we haven't really touched on.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we've talked about governments and policies and all that, but we haven't really talked about the human cost of the Gouzenko Affair. Behind all the political drama and espionage, there were real people whose lives were turned upside down.
That's a good point. We've been focused on the big picture. But what about those individual stories? What happened to Gouzenko and his family after he defected?
Well, Gouzenko and his wife basically had to disappear. They lived under assumed identities for the rest of their lives, always looking over their shoulders, afraid of what the Soviets might do.
I can't imagine living like that.
And it wasn't just them. Think about those people accused of being part of the spy ring. Their reputations were ruined, their lives were disrupted, some of them even went to prison.
It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of the spy stuff. But we can't forget that real people got hurt in all of this.
Absolutely. They became collateral damage in this bigger geopolitical struggle. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and events, it's about the human stories that unfold within those events.
So the Gouzenko affair was a real turning point for Canada, wasn't it? It forced them to confront some tough questions about its identity, its security, its role in a world that was increasingly divided by ideology.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It made Canada grow up, make some tough choices, and deal with the realities of a world that was teetering on the edge of nuclear war.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive so far. We've covered a lot of ground, from this seemingly isolated defection to its impact on Canada and the whole world. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to look at.
Yeah, and it might be the most important piece of all. The legacy of the Gouzenko Affair. How did this event shape Canada's long-term approach to security and intelligence? And what lessons can we learn from it today, in a world facing all these new threats and challenges?
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Let's unpack that legacy in part 3. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been digging into this Cold War thriller, the Gouzenko Affair, and we've seen how it really shook things up in Canada and had these ripple effects across the whole world. Yeah, a story of espionage, betrayal, political intrigue, and as we talked about, a very real human cost. But as we wrap up, I think it's really important to look at the legacy of this whole thing. What did Canada learn from the Gouzenko Affair?
Yeah, it really does feel like we've reached a turning point, right? Canada's been kind of forced onto the world stage, had to face the realities of the Cold War. What kind of lasting impact did all this have on how Canada approached security and intelligence?
Well, one of the most obvious things is that there's a much bigger emphasis on counterintelligence. On security measures, Canada expanded its intelligence agencies, tightened immigration, developed all these new strategies to try to prevent this kind of thing from happening again.
So it's like the Gouzenko Affair was a wake-up call for Canada of the threat of espionage and foreign interference. Yeah, exactly. It shattered this sense of naivete they might have had and forced the government to be much more proactive about protecting national security. And this wasn't just a temporary thing. These changes really had a lasting effect on Canada's whole security apparatus.
So are you saying we can draw a straight line from Gouzenko's defection to the way Canada deals with security today?
I think so, yeah. The Gouzenko Affair set a precedent for more surveillance, more intelligence gathering, tighter security, and that trend continued throughout the Cold War and even after. In a way, it kind of laid the groundwork for the security state we live in now, this world where surveillance is everywhere, and it feels like threats could be lurking around every corner.
It makes you wonder if maybe Canada overreacted a little. I mean, we talked about those new left historians. Who said the crackdown on suspected communists went too far?
It's a fair point, and it's something people still debate. The Gouzenko Affair really brought up these fundamental questions about the balance between national security and individual liberties. How far should a government go to protect its people? Where do you draw the line?
It's that classic dilemma, isn't it? Security versus freedom.
Yeah.
And it seems like the Gouzenko Affair really forced Canada to confront that head-on.
Absolutely, and it's something that's still relevant today. With new threats like terrorism and cyber warfare, the Gouzenko Affair is kind of a cautionary tale, reminding us that the things we do in the name of security can have consequences we don't expect.
So it's not just about stopping spies. It's about finding that balance between keeping the country safe and protecting individual rights.
Exactly. And the Gouzenko Affair also showed how important international cooperation is, especially with allies like the US and the UK. Remember the Five Eyes Alliance?
Yeah.
That got even stronger after the whole thing went down.
Right, like everyone realized they had to work together to deal with the Soviet threat.
Exactly. And it went beyond just intelligence sharing, too. Canada became more involved in Western military alliances, did joint exercises. They took a more active role in global security.
So in a way, the Gouzenko Affair kind of pushed Canada to become a more mature player on the world stage, taking on more responsibility for global security.
I think that's a good way to put it. Canada stepped out from under the shadow of the British Empire and carved out its own path as a middle power, committed to Western values, and engaged in international affairs.
It's crazy how this one event had this domino effect, shaping Canada's policies at home, its relationships with other countries, even its identity as a nation.
And I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that history matters. It shapes who we are, how we see the world, the decisions we make.
It's not just dates in a textbook, right? It's about understanding the things that have made us who we are today and learning from the past so we can make better choices in the future.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. What if Gouzenko had never defected? What if his secrets had stayed hidden?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's like those sliding doors moments in history.
Exactly. Would Canada have still been naive about the Soviet threat? Would they have done things differently during the Cold War? Would the world be different today?
Wow, that's a lot to consider. Like the butterfly effect, right? Even the smallest actions can have huge consequences.
And that's what's so fascinating about history. It's full of surprises, twists and turns, unexpected things happening. The Gouzenko Affair is a perfect example of how one person's choices, chance encounters, events that seem totally isolated, they can all have a ripple effect and change the course of history.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking the Gouzenko Affair. We've looked at the immediate impact, the global implications, the lasting legacy. It's a story that still matters today, reminding us to be vigilant, to think about the complexities of national security, and that constant tension between freedom and safety.
It's been a really interesting journey, and I hope our listeners have a better understanding now of this crucial moment in Canadian history and what it means for the world we live in today.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the stories that have shaped our world. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.